Chapter 7, Finland, Middle Ages. Killing a bear required apology rituals. In the deep forests of medieval Finland, where pines rose like pillars and snow pressed quiet upon the earth, the bear was not merely an animal. It was Kahu, the most revered of all creatures, spoken of in whispers and reverent songs, rarely named directly. To utter its true name carelessly was to risk offense. To kill it, even in necessity, demanded more than strength. It demanded ritual, humility, and apology. Because the bear, in pre-Christian and early Christian Finnish belief, was not just a beast of the woods. It was a being of profound spiritual power. Bear was feared, yes, for its strength, its ability to kill, its sudden presence at the edge of a village, but it was also honored as kin, ancestor, and sacred guest. Hunters who brought down a bear stepped across a threshold between the physical and the spiritual. The act of killing was not treated as conquest. It was treated as transgression. Even when the hunt was successful, the death of a bear was a matter of ritual danger. Something powerful had been disturbed, and it had to be set right. In the worldview of medieval Finns, shaped by centuries of animist belief, the forest was alive with spirits. Animals were not passive creatures, but fellow beings, each with its own soul, intent, and purpose. Trees, rivers, stones, these to possess presence and awareness. Among them, the bear stood highest. Its intelligence, its upright stance, its strength and solitude made it different, closer to human, yet still otherworldly. Some stories spoke of bears as children of the sky god lowered to earth to walk for a time among men. Others told of bears who could speak, who understood the thoughts of those who hunted them. To kill a bear then was never a casual thing. It was permitted, but never clean. Once the final blow had been struck, once the bear fell, breathing its last into the moss and needles, the obligation began. The hunters would not cheer. They would not boast. Instead, they would prepare. The body of the bear would be treated with solemnity. Its fur would be cleaned with care. The meat would be prepared for a ritual feast, a communal meal in which the bear's spirit was considered the guest of honor. The bear had given its body, and in return it had to be given respect. Central to the ritual was the act of apology. The bear had to be addressed directly, but never by its name. Instead, euphemisms were used. Otoso Mesikman, the honeyed one, the forest cousin. These names softened the speech, showing care and reverence. In spoken chants or sung laments, the hunters would explain themselves. They did not kill for sport, they would say. They killed for need. They begged forgiveness. They honored the bear not as a victim, but as a being who had allowed its own death. These apology songs were passed down orally, shaped by region and memory. In some, the bear was told it had been tricked or seduced, never violently overpowered. This too was a kind of softening, a ritual fiction meant to preserve balance, to say, we did not conquer you. We borrowed your strength. The bear spirit, still lingering, was thought to listen. If it accepted the apology, the community would be safe. If not, the consequences could be severe. The most potent gesture of respect came with the bear's skull. It was not discarded. It was not buried. Instead, it was placed in the page. I say ceremony, a feast in the bear's honor. To the feast, the skull was carried back into the forest and lifted high into a sacred pine tree. There, cradled in the branches, it would rest close to the sky, where the bear's soul might rise and return to its celestial origins. The bones of the bear were often placed nearby in a careful pile beneath the tree. Nothing was to be wasted. Nothing was to be treated without reverence. This practice, raising the skull, was deeply symbolic. It was not just a tribute. It was a reintegration. The bear, having been removed from the forest by death, was returned in spirit. It had not been destroyed. It had been released. By offering the skull to the heavens, the community acknowledged the bear's sacred nature and its ongoing presence. To neglect these rituals was dangerous. It was said that a bear whose death had not been honored could haunt its killer. Dreams would twist, illness would come, hunts would fail, families could suffer. The stories told of hunters who laughed at a kill and later vanished in the woods or fell to accident or madness. The bear's revenge was not immediate, but it was certain. The forest remembered. The spirits noticed. Balance, once broken, demanded restoration. Even as Christianity spread through Finland, these beliefs did not vanish. They folded into new forms, sometimes merging with Christian rites, sometimes existing alongside them. A hunter might still apologize to the bear and then cross himself. Priests might frown upon the rituals, but in the deep woods far from the churches, tradition held. The bear ceremonies persisted, evolving yet remaining rooted in their original meaning. The life taken must be acknowledged. The act must be accounted for. What makes this tradition so striking is not only its richness, but its emotional clarity. The killing of a bear was never treated as simple victory. It was a moment of tension between survival and sorrow, necessity and reverence. The ritual was not designed to erase the violence, but to face it, to name it, to shape it into something the community could carry. In that there was a kind of ethics. The hunters were not above the bear. They were participants in a shared world across the globe. Similar practices appear in other animist and indigenous cultures. The Ainu of Japan, the Sami of northern Scandinavia, certain Native American nations all have held ceremonies to honor the animals they kill. But in medieval Finland, the bear ceremony was especially detailed, especially bound to communal memory. It was not rare, it was expected. It was the cost of the forest's gift. And there is something else, a tone that runs through the rituals like a quiet chord. It is not fear exactly, nor is it guilt. It is awareness that life taken, even in hunger, creates a wound. Power used carries weight, that the world is not composed. Resources to be harvested, but of beings to be respected. This is not sentimentality, it is structure, way of living that places the sacred not above or beyond, but beside. In the poor print, the pine branch, the song rising into cold air. To hear the apology songs today where they have been preserved in folklore and recorded by ethnographers is to step into a moral world built on interconnection. There is a steadiness to them, a careful cadence. The language is poetic not to mask violence but to contain it. The words move between gratitude and mourning, making space for contradiction. Bear is called guest, father, cousin, even bridegroom in some variants. These metaphors elevate the bear not as myth but as family, a creature close enough to speak to. And so in the snows of medieval Finland, the hunter returns home not only with meat but with obligation. The village gathers, the fire is lit, the feast begins, but it is not a celebration, it is a reckoning. The bear is dead, but its spirit is present. The skull waits to be lifted high, songs rise into the branches, an apology is spoken, and the forest listening holds its breath. Chapter 8. Ireland brand laws against satirical injury. In the wooded hills and stone-ringed settlements of early medieval Ireland, long before English rule reshaped the island's legal and political map, a different kind of law held sway. It was not written in statute books or enforced by centralized courts. It moved through oral tradition, memory, and the finely tuned judgments of brands, learned jurists who carried the weight of custom on their tongues. This was the world of the Brehon laws, a decentralized and remarkably nuanced system of justice where status, kinship, and reputation governed daily life. And in this world, few forces were as dangerous or as legally fraught as satire. To call someone a poet in early Ireland was to name them as more than a writer. The Philid, the hereditary poets, were both artists and authorities. They composed praises that could elevate a chieftain's name for generations. They recited genealogies, guarded ancestral memory, and gave form to the honor of clans. But alongside them, and sometimes indistinguishable from them, stood the ether, the sadists. These were men whose words could blister. Their verses did not seek applause, but submission. In a society built on honor, the threat of public shame could strike deeper than steel. Satire in Old Irish was not mere mockery, or just that. It was a carefully crafted form, part social correction, part curse. A skilled poet could summon rhythm, imagery, and ancestral illusion to expose vanity, greed, cowardice, or injustice. The satire was often public, performed aloud, or passed in recitation through the community, and its effects were not just emotional. It was believed that a potent satire could cause actual physical harm, boils to erupt on the skin, sickness to set in, even death to follow. The words themselves held force, not metaphorical, but mystical. The Irish believed that language carried spirit. To speak something was to set it in motion. Praise could bind and uplift. Insult, when sharpened by poetic craft, could unmake. This belief was not symbolic. It was legal. Brehon laws recognized satirical injury as a legitimate harm. If a person suffered sickness, reputational damage, or measurable loss as a result of a satirist's verse, they could bring a claim. Compensation might be ordered, not just for what was said, but for the effect it had. The law did not assume that every insult deserved redress. Casual remarks or angry quarrels were another matter. But a public satire, especially one delivered in verse by a trained poet, was seen as deliberate, intentional, and dangerous. It could reduce a person's inland, their face honor, the intangible but vital sense of standing in the eyes of others. And in a society where one's value, rights, and protections were tied closely to the standing, an injury to reputation was as serious as a broken limb. Judge accounts, some legendary, others preserved in fragments of legal commentary of nobles and even kings, who suffered under the weight of satire. One story tells of a chieftain who refused hospitality to a wandering poet. In response, the poet composed a short verse accusing him of stinginess. Within days, the story goes, the man fell ill. His livestock weakened. His people whispered. Whether the illness was real or imagined, the damage was done. His name had been darkened, and with it his authority. He sent gifts, begged the poet to lift the curse, and only when the satirist composed a poem of praise did peace return. Such stories might carry exaggeration, but they express something true about the social dynamics of early Ireland. Honor was not an abstraction, it was a lived currency. To lose it through satire was not just to be embarrassed, it was to be diminished in legal and political life. And so the law, recognizing this power, sought to constrain it. Satire was not outlawed, it was respected, but it was watched. The Brehon who judged a case of satirical injury had to determine whether the satire had crossed the line. Was it fair comment or malicious attack? Was it deserved correction or abusive excess? If the victim could show that the satire had led to loss of health, of social standing, of material support, the satirist could be fined. The amount depended on the rank of the victim and the impact of the harm. In extreme cases, the poet might be exiled or stripped of legal protections, becoming a kind of outlaw in the eyes of the law. Not everyone could bring such a claim. Right to legal redress for satire depended, like so much else in Brehon law, on status. A person with no enactment, no recognized face honor, might not be able to argue that their reputation had been meaningfully damaged. But for landholders, chieftains, and those within the structured ranks of society, words could be weighed and the scale brought into court. Even poets themselves were not immune. They were feared, yes, but they were also bound. A satirist who used his skill for extortion or cruelty could be brought before Brehon and punished. Power of words was too great to leave unregulated, and so the very culture that honored the poet's voice also held it accountable. Freedom of speech in the modern sense was not a guiding principle. Speech had force. Force required responsibility. To understand why satire was treated this way, one must grasp the broader worldview of early Irish culture. It was a world in which the invisible mattered. The soul had weight. The name had power. Language shaped not just opinion, but reality. Poets were seen as vessels of divine or ancestral insight. Their verses could call down blessing or ruin. The air of the satirical poem was not simply entertainment. It was a kind of social lightning striking where restraint had failed. This view did not vanish with time. Even as Christianity took firmer hold in Ireland, the tradition of the powerful word continued. Monks recorded some of the old laws, sometimes frowning at their pagan roots, but still preserving the essence. Satire remained a respected craft, and the poet retained a strange and liminal status, part historian, part judge, part oracle. There's sharpness in this tradition, but also balance. Satire was not outlawed because it was feared. It was recognized as necessary. It kept power in check. It reminded kings that their honor was not invincible. But like all forms of justice, it had to be wielded with care. The Brehon laws did not silence the satirist. They simply asked him to answer when needed for the wounds he made. Today, in a world where words fly quickly and reputations are made and unmade in hours, the idea of legally actionable satire may feel distant. Modern systems often draw lines between opinion and defamation, between public discourse and personal attack. But early Ireland knew that speech could be dangerous long before printing presses or public platforms. They crafted a legal system that reflected that truth, not with censorship, but with consequence. To live in that time was to live in a world where a poet's voice could lift you or unmake you, where reputation was a kind of armor and words could pierce it. The Brehon law stood not only to punish crime, but to uphold balance. In doing so, they acknowledged something fundamental, that language, like law itself, is never neutral. It carries weight, it carries risk, and in the right hands or the wrong ones, it can change everything. Chapter 9, Holy Roman Empire. trial by combat legal system. In the patchwork of lordships, bishoprics, and free cities that made up the Holy Roman Empire, law did not descend from a central authority. It was local, layered, and deeply infused with tradition. What passed for justice in one principality might differ in the next, but certain practices traveled well across these fractured lands. Among them was one that stood as both spectacle and sacred ordeal, the trial by combat. In this medieval world where evidence was elusive, record-keeping rare, and the divine ever-present, truth was not always found through testimony or proof. Sometimes it had to be fought for literally. Practice bore many names, but in the German-speaking lands of the empire it was known as Gottesudel, the judgment of God. This was no metaphor. It was a legal doctrine grounded in the belief that God would intervene in human affairs to ensure that justice prevailed when human wisdom fell short. In cases where sworn oaths clashed, when both parties stood firm and the facts were murky or contested, the court could grant permission for a trial by combat. The result would not be seen merely as victory, but as divine verdict. The one who survived or forced the other to yield was by the laws of heaven and empire in the right. Unlike spontaneous brawls or private vengeance, trial by combat had rules. It was a formal process embedded in the legal customs of the empire from the early Middle Ages and codified in various Saxon, Spiegel, and Schwab and Spiegel law codes. A party would bring an accusation or claim. The accused, if denying the charge, could be challenged or could issue a challenge in return. Once the matter had been approved by the presiding judge or council, preparations for the combat would begin. The duel was not immediate. It was scheduled, regulated, and often publicized. Weapons were dictated by rank, custom, and local court decisions. Nobles might use swords, lances, or axes. Commoners might fight with clubs or shields. The duels usually took place in open fields or specially prepared arenas known as judicial rings. There were rules of engagement, how blows could be struck when a fight was over, what counted as submission. A yield might come by gesture, word, or clear physical incapacity. Killing was not always necessary, but it was certainly permitted. In the Holy Roman Empire, a party unfit to fight could appoint a champion to take their place. This was especially common among nobles and the elderly, and the practice gave rise to a class of professional duelists who offered their services in legal combat. These men were skilled, highly paid, and often feared. To hire one was not dishonorable. In fact, it was expected in many cases. The duel in this system was not about personal anger, but about justice. The combatant stood not as a hot-blooded fighter, but as an instrument of God's will. Women too were not excluded from the right to trial by combat, though their involvement followed specific conventions. In rare but documented cases, a woman accused of a serious offense or bringing such an accusation herself might face a male opponent. The setup was unique. The man stood in a pit up to his waist with one arm tied behind his back. The woman remained above ground, free to move and strike, often with a weighted club. This unequal arrangement was designed to compensate for differences in strength and to make the contest symbolically just. However rare, these duels were not fiction. They were embedded in the legal consciousness of the time, preserved in manuscript illustrations and legal commentaries. Such trials were not mere duels of honor. They carried real consequences. The victor's claim would be upheld in court, entered into the record, and enforced with the same force as any legal judgment. A man might win land, clear his name, or be acquitted of a capital charge. The loser could face exile, loss of property, or death, either in the fight itself or as a sentence following defeat. One of the most famous echoes of this practice comes not from the empire itself, but from neighboring France in the famous 1386 case between John de Carouge and Jacques Lery. Carouge accused Lery of raping his wife. With conflicting testimony and insufficient evidence, King Charles V VI authorized a judicial duel. Before a massive crowd in Paris, the two knights fought. Carouge emerged victorious and Lery was slain. The court declared justice done. Whether or not the truth was served remains unknown, but under the legal thinking of the time, God had spoken. But in the Holy Roman Empire, trial by combat reflected a convergence of warrior culture, Christian theology, and feudal law. Nobles especially saw it as an extension of their honor-bound world. To prove one's word with steel was not barbaric. It was virtuous. In a society where personal reputation formed the backbone of legal standing, public displays of courage and righteousness carried legal as well as symbolic weight. The practice was not confined to criminal accusations, disputes over property, inheritance, breach of contract, and slander could all in theory lead to combat. What mattered was the inability of traditional methods, testimony, oaths, witnesses to resolve the case. Trial by combat filled the void where human judgment could not reach. It satisfied a need for clarity sanctioned by divine will and enforced by community assent. The ceremony of these jewels could be elaborate. Combatants swore oaths before clergy. The grounds might be blessed. Spectators gathered not only for entertainment, but as witnesses to the outcome. In a world without surveillance or written evidence, the body in the ring, the swing of the sword, and the crowd's acknowledgement formed the final word in the matter. As legal thought advanced, the system faced growing criticism. By the late medieval period, the rise of Roman law and the slow centralization of judicial institutions began to erode the authority of divine orals. Universities trained jurists to rely on logic and precedent. Bishops and emperors alike came to question the idea that God revealed truth through physical strength. Some jurisdictions began requiring more stringent proof before allowing trial by combat. Others banned the practice outright. But the idea lingered even after the last sanctioned jewels faded from practice. Their memory lived on. Folk stories, legal chronicles, and colic literature preserved the image of justice by sword. In the imagination of the people, the jewel remained a powerful symbol of honor defended of wrongs right not in whispered chambers, but in open field beneath the eye of heaven. To moderns, trial by combat might seem a contradiction, a system of law that endorses violence in the name of truth. But to those who lived under it, it was no more strange than the silence of a written contract or the abstraction of a jury. It was tangible, immediate, and moral in its own logic. It recognized that evidence could be absent and that human deceit could mask itself in law. By turning to combat, the system claimed to pierce through appearances, placing the burden of proof not in paperwork but in the willingness to risk everything. There was danger in this, to be sure. The strong could prevail over the just. The skilled might vanquish the innocent. But the medieval worldview did not divide the world so cleanly. Strength was not separate from righteousness. To fight well could be a sign of divine favor. To lose, especially after swearing an oath, was to face more than defeat. It was to be judged. Trial by combat was neither chaos nor anarchy. It was role-bound, solemn, and public. It was not the failure of law, but its final extension, a sacred moment when men were made to stand, to face one another, and to declare, "Let God decide." And then, with sword or club in hand, they did. Chapter 10. Ancient Egypt. No garlic for priests. In the land of the Nile, where God shaped the course of the sun and the flooding of the river marked the rhythm of life, purity was more than a virtue. It was the foundation of existence. To maintain the cosmic order that held chaos at bay, every action, gesture, and breath had to be measured. Nowhere was this more strictly observed than in the lives of Egypt's priests, who served not only as caretakers of temples, but as mediators between the divine and the earthly. Their lives were governed by precision and abstention. In this world of layered rituals and layered meanings, even the simplest act, eating, was never simple. And so in a civilization where garlic and onions were beloved by the working class, the priests of Egypt were forbidden from consuming them. To understand this restriction, one must first understand the immense role of the priesthood in ancient Egypt. These men in church and occasionally women were not full-time religious officials in the way we might imagine today. They often held other responsibilities or lived among the elite. But when on duty, their lives transformed entirely. Service in a temple meant entering a different mode of being, one defined by purity, separation, and constant attention to spiritual cleanliness. Priests bathed in sacred pools as many as 4 times a day. They shaved their heads and every hair on their bodies to avoid any trace of impurity. They dressed only in linen, a fabric spun from flax and associated with purity, unlike wool, which was viewed as impure due to its animal origin and association with bodily odor. They abstained from sexual activity during their period of service. They avoided contact with death, blood, and any uncontrolled discharge of the body. These disciplines weren't about morality in the abstract. They were about maintaining a sacred state and interior and exterior cleanliness necessary to interact with the gods. Among the lesser known but strictly enforced disciplines was a dietary code that excluded certain pungent foods, most notably garlic and onions. These were common staples among the Egyptian population and essential in the diet of laborers, soldiers, and peasants, they were considered unfit for the temple. Reasons were spiritual, symbolic, and practical all at once. Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled to Egypt in the 5th century BCE, noted with fascination that Egyptian priests scrupulously avoided these foods. Garlic and onions, he observed, were not only excluded from the diet of temple officials, but actively forbidden. Their consumption was thought to compromise a priest's state of ritual readiness. The smell alone was considered offensive in sacred spaces, not merely unpleasant, but spiritually disruptive. This wasn't about taste. It was about the invisible realm. The breath of a priest, after all, would recite hymns to the gods, chant over offerings, breathe incense in rituals of great consequence. To carry the pungent trace of a root vegetable into that space was not only improper, it risked imbalance. Beyond their smell, garlic and onions carried deeper associations. They were linked to vitality, circulation, and heat, traits of the living body of passion, blood, and appetite. Their effects were tangible. They stirred the senses. They warmed the stomach. They were believed to stimulate desire and awaken physical energy, qualities celebrated among laborers needing strength, but seen as dangerous in the context of sacred stillness. The priest's duty was to transcend such drives. He was meant to become a vessel emptied of self-interest, emotion, or hunger. In this context, garlic and onions represented not nourishment but distraction. They were reminders of the animal and man when the priest was called to be something more. This division between sacred and profane played out in Egyptian religious life with great care. The temples were seen as the physical homes of the gods. Each statue clothed and fed through daily ritual represented a divine presence requiring exacting care. The priests did not pray to the gods as supplicants. They served them as attendants. Their job was to preserve a sense of cosmic order through unceasing repetition of ancient rites. The ritual purity of the priest was not personal. It was functional. It protected the flow of divine energy from being obstructed, and so even a common vegetable could carry the weight of disruption. Evidence from tomb inscriptions and temple texts supports the rigorous dietary restrictions placed on the priesthood. Lists of forbidden substances, rituals for cleansing, and instructions for preparation of sacred meals make it clear that food was never neutral. Every ingredient carried symbolic resonance. Bread and beer, for instance, were acceptable and often sanctified as offerings. But anything pungent, intoxicating, or otherwise provocative could not pass a priest's lips. And yet, outside the temple, garlic and onions were celebrated. Workers at the Great Pyramid sites were famously supplied with generous quantities of garlic, onions, and radishes. These were not just staples. They were sustenance, medicine, and reward. Garlic was believed to strengthen the body and fight disease. Onions were revered for their antiseptic qualities and were sometimes buried with the dead to protect the soul in its journey. Both vegetables appear in art and writing not as forbidden fruits but as essential parts of daily life. This contrast between common use and sacred prohibition reveals the subtlety of Egyptian religious logic. The priest did not deny the value of garlic or onions. He avoided them because his task required a different kind of energy, not the vitality of muscle, but the quiet intensity of spiritual focus. To serve the gods was not to reject the world, but to step carefully through it, choosing what supported purity and discarding what did not. The symbolism of these vegetables reached into deeper layers. Onions with their concentric rings may have been associated with the cycles of life, with tears, with the many layers of the self. Garlic with its fiery nature and medicinal potency evoked heat, protection, and stimulation. These were not inappropriate qualities in themselves. They were simply too strong, too evocative for the silence of the temple. Egypt's view of spiritual purity was holistic. It did not separate the moral from the physical. A smell could offend the gods as surely as a broken oath. A food could disturb a rite as surely as a misstep in a ritual dance. Cleanliness was not about outward appearance alone. It was about aligning the entire body with a state of readiness. Every substance taken in through skin, through breath, through food mattered. Other cultures would develop their own systems of abstention. Jewish dietary laws with their prohibitions on mixing meat and dairy or consuming certain animals also seek to preserve ritual distinction. Buddhist monks often avoid pungent foods such as garlic, onion, and leek, believing they disturb mental clarity. The followers of Pythagoras in ancient Greece developed strict food codes as part of their philosophical pursuit of harmony. These practices, like those of the Egyptian priesthood, arise from a shared idea that what enters the body shapes what the soul can do. In Egypt, the connection was not philosophical, it was devotional. Priest's discipline was a service to Mart, the balance that kept the stars in their courses and the Nile in its bed. His fasts and washings, his silence and sacrifices were not aimed at personal enlightenment, but at preserving a link between the human world and the divine. Garlic and onions with their earthly vigor belonged to another sphere. Honorable, useful, but unfit for the sacred breath, the avoidance of these foods was just one thread in Abba's fabric of ritual. But it reminds us that in ancient Egypt, the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were drawn with exquisite care. The body was not a neutral instrument. It was a site of transformation, a place where holiness could be nurtured or disrupted. And so every act of eating, every scent on the breath, every element of presence was watched, shaped, and sanctified. The priest who entered the temple did so with a stillness built from discipline. He brought no garlic on his breath, no onion on his tongue. He carried only linen, water, and silence. And in that carefully prepared vessel, the divine might be received unclouded, undisturbed, and pure. Chapter 11. Ancient Athens. Olive tree veneration law. On a rocky outcrop rising above the city of Athens, the gods once held a contest. Poseidon, lord of the sea, struck the earth with his trident and brought forth a salt water spring, a sign of his dominion and power. Athena, daughter of wisdom and war, answered with something quieter but far more enduring. She planted an olive tree. From the stony soil of the Acropolis, the first olive took root. It offered fruit, oil, wood, and life. The Athenians judged it the greater gift, and so the city took her name. From that moment on, the olive tree in Athens was not merely a plant. It was sacred, a living trace of divine favor and the symbol of the city's very identity. The myth lived in the soil and the law. The original tree was said to have stood near the Erechtheion, a temple to Athena on the Acropolis. According to tradition, even after the Persian king Xerxes burned this city in 480 BCE, that tree scorched, blackened, and broken sent up a new shoot the very next day. The Athenians saw this not only as a marvel, but as a reassurance. The gods had not abandoned them. The city could rebuild because its divine roots still lived. This tree and others like it were known as mori, sacred olive trees believed to be descended from Athena's original gift. Their importance was so profound that they became state property even when growing on private land. They were not to be cut, damaged, or uprooted under any circumstance. To do so was not simply to harm a tree. It was to offend the goddess, to damage a symbol of peace, to threaten the very favor that protected the city. Athenian law made that clear. To cut down a moria was to commit sacrilege, and the punishment could be as severe as exile or death. The reverence for these trees was codified into the legal and civic systems of Athens. State appointed inspectors known as epimolati were tasked with monitoring the health and presence of the morae. They cataloged them, made regular inspections, and kept records. If a tree was found damaged, an inquiry would follow. Private landowner might tend the land where the tree stood, but they did not own the tree itself. It belonged to the goddess and by extension to the city. The olive tree was more than myth. It was a foundation of the Athenian economy. Olives and olive oil were used for food, for lighting lamps, for religious anointing, and for trade. Athenian oil stored and finely decorated empori was exported across the Mediterranean. Victors at the Panathenaic Games were crowned with olive wreaths and awarded large quantities of sacred oil. It was nourishment, currency, and symbol all at once. But even amid its economic value, the sacred status of certain trees remained paramount. The mori were not harvested for profit. They stood as reminders of divine blessing, untouched by the usual rhythms of commerce. In the wider society, olive trees filled the countryside and city alike. Most were cultivated, pruned, and pressed for their fruit, but the mori were left whole. They were marked, set apart, and protected by law. Their presence created a boundary between the sacred and the ordinary, and their protection reflected how the Athenians saw themselves as guardians of order of nomos, the law that bound gods and men in shared structure. Philosophers and historians of the time understood the seriousness of this veneration. Aristotle refers to the state's oversight of sacred trees in his Constitution of the Athenians. Plutarch, writing later under Rome, recounts the miraculous regrowth of Athena's tree after the Persian sack. These references are not incidental. They reflect a deep cultural memory in which the olive tree stood not only as a historical artifact but as a present legal and spiritual concern. A tree that rooted the city to its divine protector could not be treated as mere vegetation. The laws protecting the olive trees were enforced with the same gravity as those concerning theft, treason, or religious offense. A person accused of cutting or harming a sacred tree could be brought to trial before the Areopagus, the ancient council of elders who judged cases of murder and major crimes. The charge would be considered in the context of public and religious harm. It was not a matter of property laws. It was a crime against the polis, against Athena, and against the shared identity that held Athens together. This relationship between nature and law, myth and governance offers a window into how the Athenians thought about the world. The sacred was not confined to temples or statues. It grew in the soil, stood on the land, and cast shade over the people. In venerating the olive tree, they preserved not just an agricultural resource, but a living part of their founding myth. Protection of the Mori was illegal. Expression of a cultural truth. The city existed under divine patronage, and it was the duty of all citizens to safeguard that bond. The broader worldview behind these laws reveals a civilization in which religion, law, and daily life were fully entangled. The boundaries we draw today between spiritual belief and civic order did not exist in quite the same way. For the Athenians, violating a sacred tree risked not only punishment on earth, but the withdrawal of divine favor, a risk that no responsible citizen or official would willingly take. This fusion of agriculture and religion is not unique to Athens. Across the ancient world, natural elements were often infused with sacred significance. In Rome, certain groves were considered lucas, places where trees could not be cut without ritual. In ancient Israel, the Torah includes laws that restrict the felling of fruit trees during times of war. In India, the pipal tree is still revered, linked to gods and ancestors alike. But the Athenian system stands out for how it embedded this reverence into a formal legal code with oversight, inspection, and real consequences. In the case of Athens, this reverence was not just spiritual, it was civic. The olive tree was a symbol of the city's order, prosperity, and identity. It represented Athena's wisdom and her favor. To protect the tree was to protect the story of the city itself. To harm it was to tear at the roots of what held the society together. Even the olive's qualities reinforced its symbolism. The tree is slow to grow but long-lived. It thrives in harsh conditions, putting down deep roots in rocky ground. Its fruit is bitter until cured, but then yields nourishment, light, and healing. It is not flashy, but enduring like the values the Athenians claimed for themselves. The olive was not only Athena's gift, it was a mirror of her character. That the law treated a tree with the same gravity as a person's life may seem distant now, but it reflects a vision of community in which nature, myth, and justice are indivisible. The olive tree was not sacred because it was rare, but because it was foundational. It was visible proof that the gods walked with the city and that human law could serve the divine. In a society that prized logos, word, reason, and law, the roots of a tree could speak louder than any argument. And so they were protected not as mere heritage, but as present participants in the life of the state. The olive tree was not just remembered, it was guarded. It stood as a witness to oaths, as a symbol in festivals, and as a silent, enduring sign of what made Athens more than stone and soil. In that tree, the goddess still breathed, and to strike, it was to forget who gave the city its name. Chapter 12, Switzerland. Mandatory bell, ringing for night pooping. In the high valleys of Brehon, Switzerland, long before the convenience of indoor plumbing or the flicker of electric light, human needs met mountain reality with a kind of stark ingenuity. Villages clung to slopes where streets ran narrow and steep between tightly packed timbered homes, their rooftops stacked like shingles against the wind. These were communities built for survival, where space was shared and weather ruled the rhythm of daily life. In such a setting, even the most basic act, relieving oneself, became something shaped by geography, necessity, and custom. And in the quiet hours of a cold alpine night, that custom took on a peculiar sound. The ringing of a small bell swung from a window before the contents of a chamber pot were released into the darkness below. This was not a gesture of comedy or quirk. It was a matter of safety, hygiene, and mutual respect, a compact of communal living that reflected the reality of close quarters and shared passageways. In some Swiss villages, especially in regions where homes were built with overhanging upper stories and shared exterior walkways, it became customary and in places effectively mandatory to signal with sound. Before casting night waste into the street, the bell served as a warning, a brief bright alert that something unpleasant was about to follow, and in the absence of sewers or street lights, it could make the difference between a quiet stroll and a deeply unwelcome surprise. Night came early in the mountains. Once the sun dipped behind the peaks, shadows swallowed the narrow streets. Few dared to venture far. After dark, there were no gas lamps, no lanterns strung in rows along cobbled lanes. A single oil lamp or candle might flicker in a window. In the depth of winter, snow muffled every sound, and frozen drifts narrowed the roads to twisting footpaths. It was during these hours that residents, unable or unwilling to step outside, would rely on chamber pots kept beneath beds or tucked behind wooden screens. The act itself was private, but its disposal was not. The chamber pot had to be emptied, and in the absence of latrines or running water, the simplest solution was the window. From second stories or balconies, householders would lift the pot and send its contents into the darkness down into the street below. But that street was not empty. It was a thoroughfare, a place where others walked, sometimes in the early hours, sometimes carrying loads of firewood, sometimes returning from a neighbor's house. The danger of an unannounced descent was obvious, hence the bell. Its chime cut through the dark like a polite throat clearing. It was not loud but sharpened, unmistakable. A single note summons to step aside. Some villages developed call and response patterns. Bell from the window followed by a clear or a brief shout. Others relied on a rhythm of custom so well understood that no words were needed. In some communities, failing to ring or call could lead to more than wet shoes. There were fines, public rebukes. In especially tight-knit villages, the shame of being the one who broke the code was enough to ensure compliance. What might seem humorous in modern retelling was in truth part of a deeply practical system of self-governance. The bell was one tool among many in the Alpine village's quiet choreography of coexistence. Just as walls were whitewashed in the spring and firewood stacked in strict patterns for communal use, so too was the handling of waste approached with order. Sanitation was not the state's concern. It belonged to everyone, and in a world where a single infection could devastate a household, vigilance was more than cleanliness. It was survival. We find similar practices in other European settings. In medieval Paris, householders were expected to shout "Glow, beware the water," before throwing slops into the street. Edinburgh had Garde-Loup, a cry derived from the French shouted from the upper stories of tenement houses. These calls, too, were part ritual and part necessity, markers of urban life in a time before underground pipes and garbage removal. But the Swiss version, shaped by mountain life and village interdependence, carried a different tone. It was less of a warning cry and more of a signal. Compact, restrained, deliberate. In these alpine villages, space was intimate. You knew your neighbors not just by name, but by scent, by rhythm, by the creak of their doors and the sound of their boots. Your window looked into theirs. Your path to the well passed under their eaves. This closeness required a gentleness and custom. The bell was not just about avoiding mess. It was a symbol of respect, a recognition that even in acts done under cover of darkness, one still lived among others. That even in private matters, the village remained watching, listening, connected. There is dignity in that bell. It reminds us that etiquette and sanitation, so often treated as separate, are bound together in places where lives are shared wall to wall. It is easy to forget how vulnerable people were in such settings, to cold, to infection, to one another. And yet, rather than collapse into disorder, these communities built structures of trust and mutual awareness, a shared signal, a moment's pause before a necessary act. It's likely that such customs were never officially written into royal edicts or imperial statutes. These were laws of repetition and memory passed from elder to child, from one season to the next. The Swiss, known even today for their precision and civic discipline, refined these rules not out of obsession, but from lived experience. The dangers of waste and the need for order was simply too real to ignore. Over time, the sound of the bell, like the striking of the village church clock or the echo of cattle bells in the pasture, became part of the village's soundscape. Winter added another layer. Snow narrowed the streets and softened the ground. A sudden pour of warm liquid from above could melt a path, create slick ice, or worse. Sloped alleys turned into chutes and runoff could travel. A person walking below might hear the bell and step aside, not just to avoid a splash, but to prevent slipping in the aftermath. In the hardest months, when water froze in barrels and waste disposal became more difficult, the bell was a reminder that nature's challenges required human cooperation. The system, strange as it may sound to modern ears, worked because it was shared. No one was exempt, whether farmer or shopkeeper, elder or apprentice. The expectation was the same. In that way, the bell was a kind of equalizer. It was a gentle check on behavior, a tiny public act in the midst of a private function. The one who rang it did not lose dignity. They gained trust. They participated in a shared ethic that said, I see you. I may not see your face, but I see your place in the life we share. This practice, like so many others rooted in necessity, faded with modernization. By the 19th century, many Swiss villages had begun to develop improved drainage systems. Waste was channeled into gutters or removed entirely through early municipal efforts. By the early 20th century, indoor toilets and proper plumbing reached more alpine communities and the bell was silenced. But its memory lingers in oral histories, in the quiet admiration for the precision and order of Swiss village life, and the anthropological records that capture the textures of a world no longer seen but still imaginable. If there is something humorous about the idea of a bell rung for night waste, it is only because we are so distant from its world. What it truly represents is not the absurd, but the human, the creative, practical, respectful way people once lived in proximity to one another and to the elements. The bell is a sound of civility, a chime of shared responsibility in a time before regulation, when community was the only infrastructure that mattered. In the dark, narrow streets of a snow-covered village, that soft bell meant safety. It meant someone was thinking of you, even in the most mundane moment. And that perhaps is the quietest kind of dignity, the kind that rings out not in ceremony or law, but in the small sounds of everyday yeah.